The compass needle spins like a trapped insect, clockwise then counter, refusing to settle on any direction. You hold it closer, tapping the glass face, but the erratic dance continues. Around you, the forest floor disappears into shadow beneath a canopy so dense that even at midday, only thin fingers of light penetrate the gloom. Your footsteps, which moments ago crunched on volcanic rock and dried leaves, now make no sound at all. The silence isn't peaceful. It's absolute, suffocating, as if the air itself has stopped moving. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the ancient trees, just your own breathing and the thundering of your heart. This is Aokigahara, the Sea of Trees, sprawling across 14 square miles at the northwestern base of Mount Fuji. The forest earned its name honestly. From above, the dense canopy of hemlock, cypress, and Japanese red pine creates an ocean of green that appears to swallow everything beneath it. But below that canopy, another name haunts these woods: Suicide Forest. The Western media gave it this title, but the reality behind it is grimly accurate. Since the 1950s, hundreds of people have walked into these woods with no intention of walking back out. Officials stopped publishing the exact numbers years ago, hoping that removing the statistics might remove the dark allure. It hasn't worked. But here, in this moment of complete disorientation, with your compass spinning uselessly and the world reduced to oppressive silence, you begin to understand that Aokigahara's reputation for tragedy might be masking something far older and far stranger. The suicides are real and heartbreaking, but they're recent, modern phenomena. These woods have been feared for centuries, long before anyone thought to die here. The legends speak of something else entirely. They whisper of people who vanished without choosing to, who went into the forest for firewood or to hunt and simply never emerged. Not bodies later found, not suicides, just gone, as if the earth opened up and swallowed them whole. The magnetic anomalies beneath your feet offer a rational explanation for the compass, at least. The forest sits atop a vast lava flow, rich in iron and magnetic rock that plays havoc with navigation equipment. Hikers tie colored tape to trees, creating ribbons that lead back to the paths, back to the world. Without these markers, the disorientation becomes total. Every direction looks identical. Every tree the same. The volcanic rock beneath the shallow soil makes digging nearly impossible, so the roots twist and writhe above ground, creating a gnarled landscape that seems almost deliberately maze-like. Investigators who've spent years documenting the forest's tragic use speak of something else, something they can't quite articulate. Veteran police officers and volunteers who conduct the annual body searches describe zones where their equipment fails entirely, where cameras refuse to function and flashlights dim to useless flickers. They mention areas where even the search dogs, trained and experienced, will simply stop and refuse to go further, whining and pulling back toward the path. These aren't the locations where bodies are found. These are deeper places, older places, where even the tape trails don't venture. What if the modern tragedy is simply the latest chapter in a much longer story? What if Aokigahara has always been hungry, and the desperate souls who enter seeking an end are simply the ones we notice? The ancient legends called this place Jukai, the Sea of Trees, but they also spoke of it as a demon's realm, a threshold place where the barrier between worlds grows thin. The question that hangs in the air, thick as the silence, is this: what if the forest itself is alive and hungry? And what if it has been feeding for far longer than anyone realizes? And now, the island nation of Japan sits atop one of the most geologically violent zones on Earth, where 4 tectonic plates collide beneath the ocean floor in a perpetual dance of pressure and fire. At the heart of this volcanic archipelago rises Mount Fuji, its symmetrical cone a deceptive mask of serenity over a sleeping giant. But it is not the mountain itself that harbors the darkest secrets of this landscape. Rather, it is the forest that sprawls across its northwestern base, a woodland born from catastrophe, nurtured by death, and consecrated through centuries of human suffering. In the year 864, Mount Fuji erupted with devastating force. The Jogan eruption, as it would come to be known, sent rivers of molten rock cascading down the mountain's slopes. These lava flows consumed everything in their path, obliterating entire villages and drowning fertile valleys beneath layers of superheated stone. When the eruption finally ceased, it left behind a landscape so hostile that nothing could grow there for generations. The lava cooled into a jagged, twisted terrain of sharp-edged rock, creating a foundation unlike anywhere else in Japan. This would become Aokigahara, though it would be many centuries before the forest earned its more ominous name. The volcanic rock that forms the bedrock of Aokigahara possesses unusual properties. Rich in ferrous minerals and iron compounds, the stone creates persistent magnetic anomalies throughout the forest. Compasses spin uselessly, their needles unable to find true north amid the competing magnetic fields generated by the ancient lava. Modern hikers equipped with GPS devices report similar interference, their satellites struggling to penetrate the dense canopy above, while the magnetized ground disrupts their electronic instruments below. This natural phenomenon transforms the forest into a place where navigation becomes treacherous, where marked trails can vanish from sight within mere steps, and where the same landmarks seem to appear again and again in an endless loop of disorientation. As centuries passed, soil slowly accumulated in the crevices between the lava rocks. Seeds carried by wind and bird found purchase in these pockets of earth. Trees began to grow, but their roots could not penetrate the solid volcanic stone beneath. Instead, they spread outward, twisting and turning in search of nutrients, creating a dense web of wooden tendrils that snake across the forest floor. The trees of Aokigahara grow in tortured shapes, their trunks bent at unnatural angles, their branches reaching desperately toward whatever fragments of sunlight penetrate the canopy. This canopy itself has become so thick, so impenetrably dense with overlapping leaves and intertwined branches, that even at midday, the forest floor remains locked in a state of perpetual twilight. The quality of light here is not merely dim but wrong, a grayish-green gloom that seems to absorb sound as readily as it swallows illumination. Within this lightless world, another darkness took root, one that sprang not from geology but from human desperation. During periods of famine that swept across Japan throughout the medieval era and into the early modern period, when crops failed and starvation gripped the mountain villages surrounding Mount Fuji, families faced impossible choices. The practice known as yubasute, literally meaning to abandon an old woman, emerged as a brutal solution to the mathematics of survival. When there was not enough food to sustain everyone through the winter months, the elderly were taken deep into the forest and left to die. Historical records remain ambiguous about the true extent of yubasute, with some scholars arguing it was more legend than widespread practice, while others point to documented cases and folk songs that describe the ritual in chilling detail. According to these accounts, a family member, often a son, would carry his aging parent on his back up the mountain path. They would venture beyond the boundaries of the village, beyond the cultivated fields, beyond even the hunting grounds, until they reached the heart of Aokigahara. There, in a place where the twisted roots formed impassable barriers and the eternal twilight ensured complete isolation, the elderly person would be set down upon the volcanic rock. Sometimes they were left with a small portion of food and water to ease the transition. More often, they were simply abandoned to the forest, to exposure, to starvation, to the predators that prowled beneath the dark canopy. The psychological weight of this practice cannot be overstated. Imagine the horror of being left behind, of watching your own children walk away into the gloom, their footsteps fading into the sound-dampening forest until you could no longer be certain whether they had truly gone or were merely standing just beyond your sight, hidden by the perpetual shadow. Imagine equally the torment of those who did the abandoning, who returned to their villages carrying the knowledge of what they had done, who heard their parents' voices in every rustle of leaves, who saw their faces in every patch of darkness that the firelight could not quite reach. This ancestral guilt soaked into the volcanic soil of Aokigahara just as surely as the blood of those who died there. Japanese spiritual tradition holds that those who die in states of extreme emotion, particularly anguish, despair, or rage, do not pass peacefully into the afterlife. Instead, they become yurei, vengeful spirits bound to the location of their death, unable to move on, forever trapped in the moment of their greatest suffering. The forest, already a place of natural disorientation and perpetual gloom, became in the cultural imagination a repository for these wandering dead. The yurei of Aokigahara, according to folklore passed down through generations of villagers living in Mount Fuji's shadow, do not rest quietly. They walk the twisted pathways between the roots. They call out with voices that sound almost but not quite human, mimicking the cries of children, the pleas of loved ones, the desperate shouts of fellow hikers who seem to be just ahead, always just ahead, if you would only step off the marked trail to find them. Witnesses who have spent nights in the forest describe hearing footsteps that circled their camps, always maintaining the same distance, never coming closer but never fading away. They report seeing figures standing motionless among the trees, visible only in peripheral vision, vanishing the moment you turn to look directly at them. The nature of the forest itself seems designed to amplify these supernatural terrors. The acoustic properties of Aokigahara are genuinely unusual. The combination of dense vegetation, irregular volcanic terrain, and the peculiar quality of the air creates an environment where sounds behave unpredictably. Voices seem to come from all directions at once, or from no direction at all. Footfalls on the forest floor produce muffled thuds that the surrounding vegetation quickly swallows. This natural silence is so profound that hikers report being able to hear their own heartbeats, their own breathing, the rush of blood through their veins. In such overwhelming quiet, the mind begins to generate its own sounds, to fill the void with whispers and footsteps that may or may not actually exist. The twisted roots that characterize Aokigahara create another layer of physical and psychological distress. Because the trees cannot send roots downward through the volcanic rock, their root systems have evolved into sprawling horizontal networks that can rise several feet above the ground level. These wooden barriers crisscross the forest in every direction, forming a three-dimensional maze that requires constant climbing over, ducking under, or navigating around. The physical exhaustion this produces is considerable, but more insidious is the way it destroys any sense of making progress. You might climb over the same fallen tree trunk a dozen times without realizing it. You might duck beneath the same gnarled root system from different angles and believe you are pushing forward into new territory when in fact you are simply traveling in circles. This maze-like quality of the forest floor combines lethally with the magnetic interference and the light-absorbing canopy. Even experienced hikers equipped with modern technology have found themselves hopelessly lost within minutes of leading marked trails. The volcanic rock makes it impossible to leave footprints or other tracking marks. The perpetual twilight robs you of the ability to navigate by the sun's position. The magnetic anomalies render compasses worthless. The acoustic deadness prevents you from calling out effectively for help. And the twisted roots ensure that even if rescuers come within yards of a lost person, they might pass by without ever making visual contact. It is within this context that the folklore of the Yurei takes on additional dimensions. The spirits are said to target those who wander alone, those who stray from the established paths, those who show signs of vulnerability or despair. They whisper suggestions, plant ideas, encourage just one more step away from safety. Some legends claim the Yurei are malevolent, seeking to create more of their own kind by driving the living to join them in death. Other interpretations suggest a more tragic motive, that the abandoned dead of Aokigahara are desperately lonely, that they simply want companionship in their eternal isolation, that they call out to the living not from malice, but from an overwhelming desire to not be alone anymore. The historical practice of Ubisuit ceased, but the forest never forgot. Each generation added new layers to the mythology, new stories of encounters with the supernatural, new warnings about the dangers that lurked beneath the dark canopy. By the 20th century, Aokigahara had acquired a reputation as a place fundamentally opposed to human life, a landscape where the natural and supernatural conspired together to create an environment of profound psychological and physical threat. What makes Aokigahara particularly unsettling is the way its genuine geological and biological characteristics align so perfectly with supernatural folklore. The magnetic interference is measurable and scientifically documented. The acoustic properties are real and reproducible. The difficulty of navigation is not imaginary, but a natural consequence of the terrain and vegetation. Yet these factual elements blend seamlessly with tales of Yurei and vengeful spirits, until it becomes impossible to separate the natural from the supernatural, the real from the imagined, the documented from the legendary. The darkness that inhabits Aokigahara is therefore not a recent phenomenon, but rather something woven into the very fabric of the place. It existed in the violence of the volcanic eruption that created the landscape. It grew deeper with each elderly person abandoned to die alone in the twilight beneath the trees. It crystallized into cultural memory through generations of ghost stories and spiritual warning. Long before the forest gained its contemporary reputation, it was already a place where death and despair had made their home, where the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond had grown dangerously thin, where the past refused to release its grip on the present. The morning of October 7, 2019, began like countless others in the shadow of Mount Fuji. 4 men gathered at the trailhead of Aokigahara Forest, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air. They were not tourists stumbling unprepared into Japan's most notorious wilderness. They were experienced outdoorsmen, men who understood the language of the forest, who could read the land like others read books. Kenji Tanaka, the group's leader, had logged over 300 hiking expeditions across Japan. His companions, Hiroshi Matsumoto, Takeshi Yamada, and Ryo Nakamura, were equally seasoned. Together they represented over 60 years of combined outdoor experience. They carried professional-grade equipment, detailed topographical maps, and emergency supplies that could sustain them for a week if necessary. By all rational measures, they were prepared for anything the forest might present. They entered Aokigahara at 9:15 in the morning, following a well-marked trail that hundreds of hikers traverse each year without incident. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. 3 other hiking groups saw them that morning, exchanging pleasant greetings as they passed. One couple later told investigators they remembered thinking how professional the Tanaka group looked, how organized and confident. The forest swallowed them shortly after 10 o'clock, the dense canopy of Japanese cypress and hemlock closing overhead as they moved deeper into the woodland. It was the last time anyone saw all 4 men together. When the group failed to return by nightfall, their families initially felt concern rather than panic. Perhaps they had decided to camp overnight, to extend their adventure. But when morning came with no word, when calls to their mobile phones went unanswered, concern transformed into something darker. By noon on October 8, search and rescue operations were underway. The Yamanashi Prefecture Police coordinated with local volunteers, assembling a team of 45 searchers who knew Aokigahara intimately. They understood its reputation, its history, the weight of sorrow that seemed to hang in the air between the trees. But they also knew the trails, the clearings, the landmarks that guided people through. What they found on the afternoon of the second day defied all conventional understanding of how people become lost in the wilderness. 3 kilometers from where the Tanaka group had last been seen, in a small clearing off the main trail, search coordinator Masato Suzuki and his team discovered 4 backpacks. They were not scattered or discarded in panic. They were arranged with deliberate precision in a perfect circle around an ancient Japanese cypress, a tree that local forestry records suggested was over 400 years old. Each backpack sat equidistant from its neighbors, forming a geometric pattern too exact to be accidental. The zippers were all closed. The contents appeared undisturbed. Suzuki, a man with 22 years of search and rescue experience, later described the scene with words that carried an edge of something he could not quite name. "I have found lost equipment hundreds of times," he told investigators during the official inquiry. "People drop things when they panic. They abandon weight when they run. But this was different. This was arranged. Someone took time to place these packs precisely, to measure the distances, to create this pattern. But why? And where were the men who owned them?" Inside the backpacks, searchers found everything the group should have needed to survive and navigate. Food supplies, water, first aid equipment, emergency blankets. But it was the compasses that transformed confusion into something approaching dread. Each man had carried a compass, standard equipment for any serious hiker. When searchers opened the backpacks, they found all 4 compasses still inside. And every single one, despite being different brands and models, pointed inward toward the ancient tree. Not north, not toward any magnetic pole. Inward, toward the center of the circle, as if the tree itself had become the lodestone around which all direction pivoted. Suzuki had one of his team members retrieve a compass from their own gear. When brought into the circle, it too swung inward, the needle quivering as it pointed toward the tree's massive trunk. Move outside the circle by 3 meters, and the compass functioned normally, finding true north without hesitation. But within that specific area, within that precise arrangement of abandoned belongings, every compass agreed on a direction that should not exist. The search intensified. Thermal imaging equipment was deployed. Tracking dogs were brought in, given clothing from the men's homes to establish scent trails. The dogs reached the circle of backpacks and stopped. They whined, ears flat against their heads, refusing to move beyond that perimeter, despite handlers' encouragement. One dog, a German shepherd named Hannah, with 6 years of search experience, began to howl, a mournful sound that seemed to echo longer than it should in the dense forest. She never howled on searches. Her handler eventually had to remove her from the operation, disturbed by behavior he had never witnessed in their years working together. The search parties spread out in expanding grids, calling the men's names until their voices grew hoarse. Aokigahara is not an enormous forest. It covers approximately 35 square kilometers. With dozens of searchers combing the area, with helicopters equipped with thermal cameras scanning from above, it seemed impossible that 4 grown men could remain hidden. Yet the forest yielded nothing. No footprints beyond the circle. No broken branches marking a panicked flight. No signs of struggle or injury. Just silence, the kind of silence that feels less like an absence of sound and more like a presence of something that refuses to let sound exist. Then came the equipment failures. Suzuki documented them meticulously in his reports, perhaps hoping that writing them down would make them seem more rational. Radio communications, which had functioned perfectly throughout the first day of searching, began to deteriorate on the afternoon of the second day, right around the time they discovered the arranged backpacks. Searchers found themselves unable to transmit back to base camp. Their radios would produce only static, or stranger still, would occasionally emit fragments of voices that belonged to none of their team. Words in Japanese, but sentences that made no sense, that seemed to come from conversations happening somewhere else. Someone else. Mobile phones fared no better. Despite several areas of the forest having cellular coverage, phones refused to maintain signals. Batteries drained at impossible rates. One searcher started the morning with a fully charged phone, only to have it die completely within 2 hours, the battery indicator dropping from 100% to 0 in a matter of minutes. When he returned to base camp and plugged it in, the phone functioned normally, charging as expected. But back in the search grid, particularly near that ancient tree, technology became unreliable at best and actively malicious at worst. The silence Suzuki mentioned in his testimony deserves deeper examination. Aokigahara, like any forest, should contain ambient sound. Birds calling, small animals moving through underbrush, wind rustling leaves. Searchers reported that as they worked the grid around the circle of backpacks, these sounds faded. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if they had crossed an invisible threshold into a space where the normal rules of the natural world held less sway. Some reported a pressure in their ears, the sensation of descending rapidly in an aircraft. Others described feeling watched, though no matter how quickly they turned, no one was ever there. On the morning of October 10th, 72 hours after the Tanaka group had entered the forest, a forest ranger named Yuki Tanabe was patrolling the northern edge of Aokigahara, several kilometers from the main search area. She found Takeshi Yamada sitting on the ground just inside the tree line, his back against a rock, staring at nothing. He was alive, but unresponsive. His clothes were dirty but not torn. He had minor scratches on his hands and face, the kind you might get pushing through dense vegetation, but no serious injuries. His vital signs were stable. But when Tanabe spoke to him, asked his name, asked what had happened, Yamada looked through her as if she were made of glass. He was transported immediately to Fujikawa-Guchiko Municipal Hospital. Doctors found him physically healthy apart from mild dehydration and exhaustion. No head trauma. No signs of drug use or poisoning. But Takeshi Yamada, a man who had been a high school teacher, who colleagues described as articulate and precise in his speech, could not tell anyone where he had been or what had happened to his friends. The previous 72 hours existed in his mind as simply blank space, a void where memory should reside. What he could talk about What he repeated with disturbing consistency was the woman in white. Nurses reported that he spoke of her constantly in those first days after his recovery, his voice flat, reciting the words as if reading from a script written in a language he did not quite understand. The woman in white who walks between the trees, he would say. She does not touch the ground. She does not make sound. She walks between the trees and they follow her. I should have followed her. Why did I not follow her? When pressed for details, Yamada could provide none. He could not describe her face or her age. He could not say when he had seen her or where in the forest this encounter had occurred. He only knew, with the certainty of someone reciting fundamental truth, that she existed, that she walked in Aokigahara, and that she was somehow central to everything that had happened. After 6 days, he stopped speaking of her voluntarily, though if asked directly, his answer never changed. The woman in white. Between the trees. Always between the trees. Search operations continued for 3 weeks. Every trail was walked. Every clearing examined. Teams expanded their search beyond Aokigahara's boundaries, considering the possibility, however unlikely, that the men had somehow traveled farther than seemed possible. Divers searched the caves formed by ancient lava flows beneath the forest. Volunteers with metal detectors swept areas searching for belt buckles, zippers, any metal objects the men might have carried. The effort represented one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history. They found nothing. No bodies. No additional evidence. No explanation for how 3 men could vanish so completely that not even bones or fabric remained. The forest kept its secrets, as forests do, but with a completeness that seemed almost deliberate, almost spiteful. Takeshi Yamada underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluation. Neurologists found no evidence of traumatic brain injury that might explain his amnesia. Psychologists noted symptoms consistent with dissociative amnesia, a condition where the mind protects itself from traumatic memories by blocking them entirely. But typically, such memories eventually resurface, triggered by sounds or smells or similar environments. For Yamada, nothing returned. The 72 hours remained absent, a hole in his life's narrative that no amount of therapy could fill. He returned to teaching 6 months later, attempting to rebuild some normalcy. Students and colleagues reported he seemed changed, quieter, prone to staring out windows toward the tree line visible from the school. He resigned after 1 semester, unable to provide a clear reason. Those who knew him said he seemed to be listening for something, waiting for something, though he could never articulate what. He moved to Osaka, far from Aokigahara, far from the mountains and the forests. But distance, it seems, offers no protection from memory, even memories you cannot consciously recall. The case officially remains unsolved. The Yamanashi Prefecture Police maintain open files on Kenji Tanaka, Hiroshi Matsumoto, and Ryo Nakamura. Their families hold memorial services without bodies to bury, without closure, without answers. The circle of backpacks, photographed extensively for evidence, was eventually removed from the forest. The ancient tree around which they were arranged still stands, marked now in the private maps of forest rangers who ensure their routes do not pass too close. Locals who live in the towns surrounding Aokigahara have their own explanations, passed in quiet conversations, in warnings given to curious visitors. The forest has always taken people, they say, but sometimes it takes them differently, takes them completely, leaves just enough evidence behind to ensure that the mystery compounds the terror. The woman in white appears in stories dating back centuries, though descriptions vary. A scorned wife, a murdered traveler, a nature spirit older than the forest itself. She walks between the trees, locals claim, and those who see her are offered a choice. Though what choice and to what end, the stories never quite make clear. What remains undeniable is this. 4 experienced men entered a forest on a clear autumn day, following marked trails, carrying every tool modern outdoorsmen possess. 3 never emerged. The 4th returned transformed, carrying memories he cannot access and knowledge he cannot explain. Their compasses pointed inward, towards something that should hold no magnetic attraction. Their belongings were arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. And somewhere in the 35 square kilometers of Aokigahara Forest, in the shadow of Mount Fuji, beneath the dense canopy that blocks the sun, the silence continues its vigil. The woman in white, if she exists, walks between the trees still, waiting for the next hikers to lose their way, waiting to offer them choices they will never remember making, waiting to add their stories to the endless collection of those who entered the forest and simply ceased to be. The forest floor tells stories through the artifacts left behind. Among the most unsettling are the trails of plastic tape, bright ribbons of color winding through the darkness between ancient trees, stretching into sections of Aokigahara where few dare to venture. These markers, seemingly innocent navigational aids, have become something far more sinister in their implications and their inexplicable behaviors. Plastic tape has long been used by hikers and foresters to mark paths through dense woodland. The logic is simple and practical. Tie bright tape to branches at regular intervals, creating a visible trail that leads back to safety. In most forests around the world, this system works without incident. But Aokigahara is not most forests. Here, the tape trails have developed a reputation that chills even experienced search and rescue volunteers. They wind impossibly deep into unmarked territory. They lead to places where compass needles spin uselessly. And most disturbing of all, they sometimes seem to move of their own accord. The typical discovery follows a familiar pattern. A visitor, often someone searching for a missing person or a volunteer conducting a sweep, finds the beginning of a tape trail near one of the established paths. The tape is usually fresh, the colors still vibrant against the dark volcanic rock and twisted vegetation. Yellow is common, so is orange, and occasionally red. The finder follows the trail, assuming they are tracking someone who became lost, someone who had the presence of mind to mark their route. But as the trail extends deeper, something begins to feel wrong. The intervals between markers become irregular. The tape appears on trees that would have required difficult detours to reach. And sometimes, witnesses report, the trail seems to circle back on itself in ways that make no geographic sense. By 2003, park officials had documented dozens of these tape trails, each one photographed and logged as part of ongoing efforts to understand the forest's dangers. It was in the autumn of that year that researcher Kenji Nakamura decided to conduct a systematic study of the phenomenon. Nakamura was a cultural anthropologist from Kyoto University, specializing in death rituals and the psychology of suicide sites. He had visited Aokigahara multiple times over the previous 2 years, interviewing volunteers and studying the patterns of how people entered and moved through the forest. The tape trails fascinated him because they represented a paradox. They suggested both the desire to return and the journey toward not returning. On October 15, 2003, Nakamura entered the forest with comprehensive documentation equipment. He carried a digital video camera, a still camera, a GPS device, and detailed topographic maps. He also brought 3 notebooks in which he meticulously recorded his observations in real time. His plan was straightforward. He would locate a fresh tape trail, follow it to its terminus, and document everything along the way. The video footage would provide a continuous record, while his written notes would capture details, timestamps, and his immediate impressions. He found his subject quickly, a trail of bright yellow tape beginning just off the main northwestern path. His initial video footage, later recovered and analyzed extensively, shows him approaching the first marker. His voice on the recording is calm and professional as he describes the tape, noting that it appears to be standard commercial marking tape, approximately 5 centimeters wide, tied loosely around a branch at roughly eye level. He begins to follow the trail, camera in hand, dictating observations as he walks. The early portion of his journey proceeded without incident. His video shows marker after marker, each one clearly visible from the previous position. His written notes from this period correspond exactly with what the camera recorded. Yellow tape on a twisted pine. Yellow tape on a moss-covered boulder. Yellow tape hanging from a low branch that forced him to duck. He noted in his journal that the markers were placed approximately every 15 to 20 meters, a reasonable interval for maintaining visual contact with the next marker. But approximately 45 minutes into his documentation, discrepancies began to emerge. Discrepancies that would later baffle everyone who reviewed his material. According to Nakamura's written field notes, time-stamped at 2:47 in the afternoon, the tape trail turned sharply eastward, marked by a distinctive section of orange tape tied to a dead tree with exposed roots. He noted this change in his journal, describing the shift in color and wondering in his written commentary whether multiple people had contributed to the trail or whether the original marker had simply run out of yellow tape and switched to orange. But the video footage from that exact timestamp tells a different story. On camera, the tape remains yellow. There is no orange tape visible in any frame from that period. More disturbing still, the video shows the trail continuing almost due north, not eastward as his notes indicate. The dead tree with exposed roots that he described in detail appears nowhere in the video record. At first, investigators who later reviewed the materials assumed Nakamura had made an error in his written notes, perhaps becoming disoriented or documenting observations out of sequence. But as the timeline continues, the inconsistencies multiply and become more impossible to explain away as simple mistakes. At 3:18 in the afternoon, his notes describe the tape turning red, with markers now appearing on both sides of the path, creating what he called a corridor effect. He wrote that the double marking made him uneasy, as if something was trying to ensure he could not lose the trail. Yet the video from that time shows only single yellow markers, placed sporadically on the right side of his path. The footage does capture something else, though. Something Nakamura apparently did not notice at the time, as he makes no mention of it in his notes. The audio quality on his camera was good, designed for documentary work in quiet environments. And in the background of his narration, beneath his descriptions and observations, there are other sounds. Whispers, so faint that they were only detected when audio specialists enhanced the recordings weeks later. The whispers are in Japanese, but not any form of Japanese spoken in the modern era. Linguistic experts who analyzed the recordings identified fragments of grammar and vocabulary consistent with Old Japanese, dialects that date back to the Heian period, roughly the 8th through 12th centuries. The words are not entirely clear, degraded by distance and the ambient sounds of the forest, but several phrases were reconstructed with reasonable confidence. One repeated phrase translates roughly as the bound path. Another, appearing multiple times across the recording, seems to say follow to the center. A third phrase, the clearest and most disturbing, translates as he walks willingly. Now. Nakamura's own voice shows no awareness of these whispers. He continues his clinical documentation, describing vegetation, noting changes in elevation, commenting on the increasing density of the undergrowth. But the whispers continue, a constant accompaniment that seems to ebb and flow with his movement through the forest. At 4:31, more than 3 hours into his documentation, Nakamura's video shows him reaching a point where the tape trail simply ends. The final marker is tied to a large cedar tree, the bark scarred and blackened with age. The tape hangs limply, its end ragged as if cut or torn. And carved into the tree's bark, approximately half a meter above the tape, is a symbol. The video captures it clearly. A complex design that resembles neither Japanese characters nor any standard marking system used by forestry services or search teams. The symbol consists of concentric circles intersected by lines that radiate outward at irregular angles, with smaller curved marks along the periphery. Nakamura's reaction, captured on his audio, is confusion mixed with concern. He circles the tree, camera running, documenting that there is no continuation of the trail in any direction. No more tape, no signs of passage, no indication of where the person who placed these markers might have gone. In his notebook, he sketched the symbol carefully and wrote a single question: dead end or destination? He decided to document the immediate area before attempting to follow his own trail back to the established paths. For 17 minutes, his video shows him examining the surrounding trees, looking for any other markers, any sign of human presence. It's during the search that the whispers in the background audio become more pronounced, more frequent. The phrase "the bound path" repeats 6 times in a span of 3 minutes. And then a new voice joins the whispers, deeper and more distinct. This voice speaks a phrase that linguists could not confidently translate, though the closest approximation suggests something about wearing the path or walking in place. When Nakamura's body was found 8 days later, he was sitting at the base of that same cedar tree, the one marked with the symbol. He had died from exposure and dehydration. His video camera was still in his hand, powered off. His notebooks were in his pack. The last entry dated the day he entered the forest, but there were details that made no sense to the recovery team. First, Nakamura's GPS device, which had been recording his position throughout his journey, showed a track that terminated at a location 300 meters west of where his body was found. The GPS indicated he had never moved beyond that point, despite video evidence showing he continued much further. Second, when the recovery team followed what they assumed was Nakamura's return path, they found no yellow tape, no markers of any kind leading to that cedar tree. They had located him only because a search grid eventually covered the area, not by following any trail. Third, and most disturbing to those who knew him, Nakamura's body showed no signs of distress. People who die from exposure and dehydration typically show evidence of struggle, of attempts to find water or shelter. Nakamura appeared to have simply sat down at the base of the tree and remained there until death came. His expression, according to the official report, was peaceful. The investigation into tape trails intensified after Nakamura's death. Volunteer groups began documenting every instance they found, taking photographs, recording GPS coordinates, and noting the condition and color of the tape. Over the following 2 years, 47 distinct tape trails were cataloged. Of these, 31 led to dead ends, similar to what Nakamura had documented. Trees marked with symbols, the tape simply stopping with no continuation, and no sign of the person who placed it. The symbols varied, but certain elements appeared repeatedly. Circles and radiating lines were common. So were spiral patterns and designs that resembled stylized eyes. Some symbols were carved deeply into bark, requiring significant time and effort. Others were drawn in what appeared to be charcoal or some dark pigment. 3 of the marked trees showed symbols that seemed to have been burned into the wood, though no evidence of fire damage existed beyond the symbol itself. Theories about the tape trails proliferated. The most common assumption was that they represented the final journeys of people who came to Aokigahara intending to die, marking their path in case they changed their minds. This explanation satisfied most casual inquiries but fell apart under closer examination. Why would the trails lead so far into unmapped territory when most completed suicides were found much closer to established paths? Why would someone mark their return path so carefully and then not use it? And most importantly, why did the tapes sometimes appear in places that required climbing or navigation skills beyond what most desperate individuals possessed? Another theory suggested the trails were left by people who became genuinely lost, who wandered deeper into the forest while trying to find their way out. But this failed to explain the systematic nature of the markers, the regular intervals, or the deliberate placement on trees at consistent heights. Someone lost and panicking would not create such methodical trails. A darker theory, whispered among volunteers and local residents, proposed that the trails were deliberately created to lure others deeper into the forest. That something within Aokigahara, whether human or otherwise, was mimicking the behavior of lost travelers to draw in rescuers, or the curious. This theory gained traction after several documented cases where search parties following tape trails reported feelings of being watched, of hearing movement in the undergrowth that would stop when they stopped, resume when they moved. In one incident in 2025, a 4-person team following an orange tape trail reported that the tape appeared to be fresh, recently placed, yet led them to a tree carved with symbols weathered enough to be decades old. The question of mimicry became more prominent as researchers began comparing the marked trees. The symbols, while varied, showed a consistency of execution that suggested either a single creator or a shared system of meaning. But no archaeological or anthropological records showed similar markings in the region's history. They did not match Ainu symbols, traditional Japanese characters, or Buddhist iconography. They appeared to be unique to these specific trees, in this specific forest, associated specifically with tape trails that led nowhere. Some researchers noted the parallels to luring behavior observed in nature. Certain predators create patterns or signals that attract prey. Could something in Aokigahara, whether natural or supernatural, have developed a similar strategy? The tape trails looked like the work of humans in distress, triggering the rescue impulse, drawing people deep into areas where communication equipment failed and navigation became unreliable. The linguistic analysis of the whispers on Nakamura's recordings added another layer of mystery. If the voices were speaking Old Japanese, they originated from a time nearly 1,000 years in the past, long before plastic tape existed, long before the modern association between Aokigahara and suicide. Yet the phrases seem to reference the trails directly. The bound path could refer to tape binding trees. Follow to the center suggested intentional guidance. These were not random fragments of ancient language. They seemed contextually aware, contemporary in their meaning, if not their vocabulary. To this day, tape trails continue to appear in Aokigahara. Despite increased patrols and the removal of markers by park officials, new trails are found regularly. Some appear overnight in areas that were cleared the previous day. Others extend deeper into the forest over time, as if being added to by an unseen hand. The trees with symbols remain, too weathered and deep in the forest to remove easily, standing as silent markers of something that continues to defy explanation. Those who study the phenomenon most seriously have stopped trying to force it into comfortable categories. The tape trails are not simply the remnants of the suicidal or the lost. They represent something more complex and more disturbing. A pattern that mimics human behavior while serving purposes we cannot yet comprehend, leaving trails that exist in multiple states at once. Physical markers that somehow shift and change when no one is watching, guiding the curious and the concerned to trees marked with ancient symbols in a forest that has never offered easy answers to any question posed within its boundaries. The forest reveals itself differently to those who search for the dead. Hideo Watanabe learned this truth during his first year as a volunteer with the Aokigahara Patrol, and in the 17 years since, he has walked paths that should not exist and seen things that resist all reasonable explanation. Watanabe keeps his patrol logs in weathered notebooks, each one filled with coordinates, dates, and observations written in precise handwriting. But there are entries he rarely shows to anyone, passages where his methodical documentation gives way to something else entirely. Accounts of trails that appear between one patrol and the next, winding through sections of forest the volunteers know intimately. Clearings that hold no place on any topographical map, yet multiple team members find them, always in the same impossible locations. The volunteers call them the wrong paths. They emerge overnight, obvious and well-worn, as if countless feet have traveled them for years. Watanabe first encountered one during an early morning patrol in 2008. He and two other volunteers were working a grid pattern in the northwest section, an area they had covered dozens of times before. The trail appeared between two marker trees the team used for navigation, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, the volcanic soil packed smooth and dark. Watanabe's instinct told him something was off immediately. The forest doesn't change like this, not in well-traveled areas where volunteers pass through multiple times each week. But the path looked so natural, so established, that his companions initially assumed they had simply overlooked it before. They followed it for approximately 20 minutes, moving steadily deeper into a section of forest that should have been familiar territory. The trail ended in a clearing roughly 15 meters across. The ground was covered in a carpet of moss, so uniform it looked almost manicured. And in the center of this clearing stood a woman in a blue dress, her back to the patrol team, perfectly still. Watanabe called out to her. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge them in any way. He called again, louder this time, and took several steps forward. One of his companions grabbed his arm. The volunteer, a retired schoolteacher named Tanaka, pointed at the woman without speaking. Watanabe looked more carefully and felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman cast no shadow, despite the morning sun filtering through the canopy above. Her dress didn't move, not even slightly, though a breeze was stirring the leaves around them. They backed away slowly, maintaining visual contact with the figure until the trees obscured her from view. When Watanabe returned 3 days later with a different team and a GPS unit programmed with the exact coordinates, they found no clearing. The wrong path had vanished entirely. The forest in that location was dense and undisturbed, thick with undergrowth that would take years to establish. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the following months, 4 different patrol teams reported finding the same clearing, always accessed by a different route, always containing the woman in blue. Same dress, same posture, same impossible stillness. Volunteers who saw her described an overwhelming sense of wrongness, a bone-deep certainty that they were looking at something that should not exist in the waking world. The wrong paths appear most frequently in autumn and winter, during the seasons when the forest sees the most visitors and, inevitably, the most deaths. Sometimes they're narrow tracks that wind between trees, barely wide enough for single-file walking. Other times they're broad trails that look decades old, lined with stones and marked with signs of regular use. They always lead somewhere specific. A clearing, a rock formation, a particular grove of trees. And in these places, the volunteers encounter what Watanabe describes as inconsistencies in the normal order of things. Then there are the footprints. This phenomenon troubles the patrol volunteers more than anything else they experience, because it's so undeniably physical, so impossible to dismiss as tricks of light or tired minds imagining things in the shadows. Watanabe documented his first experience with duplicate footprints in 2011. He was walking a trail in the eastern section, alone despite protocol, responding to a reported sighting from earlier that day. The trail was muddy from recent rain, and his boots left clear impressions in the soft ground. He walked for perhaps 30 minutes, moving steadily uphill on a path he knew well. Then he saw them ahead of him. His own footprints, perfect matches for his boots, pressed into the mud and leading forward along the trail. Fresh prints, with water still seeping into the depressions. Watanabe stopped walking and stood perfectly still, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no loop in the trail, no way he could have circled back without realizing it. And the prints led forward, in the direction he had been heading, not back the way he had come. He marked the location and retreated, following his original prints back downhill. When he returned the next day with 2 other volunteers, they found both sets of footprints still visible. His boots from the first visit, and the identical set that had appeared ahead of him, overlapping in some places, diverging in others. The second set continued for approximately 200 meters before vanishing abruptly in the middle of the trail, not fading or becoming unclear, but simply stopping as if the person walking had ceased to exist mid-stride. Other volunteers have reported similar experiences, finding their own footprints on paths they've never walked, seeing their exact boot treads in locations they couldn't possibly have reached. One volunteer described following a set of prints that matched his shoes perfectly, tracking them for over an hour as they led deeper into an unfamiliar section of forest, only to find them ending at a small shrine where someone had left a photograph. The picture showed the volunteer himself, standing in the exact spot where he now stood, though he had no memory of ever being there before, no memory of anyone taking his photograph. The patrol teams have developed rules around these occurrences. When you find your own prints ahead of you, you stop immediately and return to your last known checkpoint. You do not follow them further. You do not investigate where they lead. Several volunteers have violated this rule over the years, driven by curiosity or the stubborn need to find rational explanations. Most return, shaken but unharmed, speaking of trails that loop impossibly back on themselves, of walking for hours while their GPS insists they haven't moved at all. One volunteer didn't return for 16 hours, and when other teams finally found him, he was walking in circles in a small area, insisting that only 20 minutes had passed and that the sun had never moved from its position directly overhead. But the most disturbing phenomenon, the one that has caused patrol teams to implement their strictest protocols, involves the voices. The mimicry that happens after dark in Aokigahara's depths. The incident that established the unspoken rules happened in 2014. A 5-person patrol team was working a night search, looking for a man whose car had been found at a trailhead that morning. Night patrols are controversial, considered dangerous even by volunteers who have worked the forest for years, but they're sometimes necessary when time is critical. The team spread out in a standard search pattern, maintaining voice contact, calling out to each other every few minutes to ensure everyone remained within range. Around 10:30 in the evening, they heard distress calls. A man's voice, crying out for help, somewhere to the north of their position. The team leader, a veteran volunteer named Sasaki, immediately called his team together, and they moved toward the sound. The voice called out again, clearer now, shouting that he was injured, that he couldn't move, begging them to hurry. Sasaki led his team deeper into the forest, following the cries for help. The voice was leading them away from their planned search grid into a section of forest known for its difficult terrain. But the distress in those calls was compelling, impossible to ignore. They pushed through dense undergrowth for nearly 20 minutes, the voice always ahead of them, always just out of reach. Then one of the team members, a woman named Yoshida, grabbed Sasaki's shoulder and pointed her flashlight at him. She asked him to stop calling out. Sasaki looked at her, confused. He hadn't said anything for several minutes, had been concentrating on navigating the difficult terrain. The distress calls came again, the same voice, the same desperate pleas for help. And Sasaki recognized it. The voice was his own. Perfect mimicry, his exact tone and inflection, calling out in distress, leading his own team deeper into the forest. The 5 volunteers stood in silence, listening to Sasaki's voice crying out from somewhere in the darkness ahead, while Sasaki himself stood among them, saying nothing. They retreated immediately, maintaining absolute silence, following their GPS coordinates back to their vehicles. The voice followed them for a while, still calling out, still begging for help, still using Sasaki's voice. Then it began to change, cycling through the voices of each team member in turn, as if whatever was making the sounds was showing them what it could do. Other teams have reported similar experiences, hearing colleagues calling for help from locations where those colleagues couldn't possibly be, following voices deeper into the forest, only to realize the person whose voice they're hearing is walking right beside them. The phenomenon is always the same. The mimicry is perfect, capturing not just the sound of someone's voice, but their patterns of speech, their emotional tone, even their breathing. The patrol volunteers now have absolute rules about voices after sunset. You maintain visual contact with your team at all times. If you hear someone calling out, you verify visually before responding. If you hear your own voice, or the voice of a team member you can see, you leave the area immediately. You do not investigate. You do not try to find the source. You acknowledge that something in Aokigahara can listen to you, learn from you, and use what it learns for purposes no one fully understands. Watanabe has theories, though he's careful to present them as nothing more than speculation. He believes the forest has a kind of memory, that it records the presence of everyone who enters it, and sometimes plays these recordings back in fragments, incomplete and distorted. He points to the electromagnetic anomalies some researchers have detected in certain areas, suggests that perhaps these fields can capture and replay sounds, images, even the impressions left by human presence. But late at night, when the practical explanations feel thin and inadequate, Watanabe admits to a different suspicion, that something in Aokigahara is actively aware of those who search for the dead, that it watches the patrol volunteers and learns from them, that it creates the wrong paths and the duplicate footprints and the mimicking voices for reasons that have nothing to do with electromagnetic fields or natural phenomena. The patrol volunteers continue their work regardless. They walk the trails in all weather and all seasons, searching for those who can still be saved and bearing witness to those they find too late. They navigate around the wrong paths when they appear and carefully avoid following their own footprints into unknown territory. They maintain silence after dark and verify every voice they hear against the physical presence of their team members. Because someone has to search the forest, and someone has to know its dangers. Not just the obvious tragedy of those who come to die, but the deeper strangeness that waits in certain clearings, on certain trails, in the patient darkness between the trees. The volunteers accept this knowledge as part of their duty, another weight to carry alongside the grief and exhaustion that come with their work. Watanabe still patrols regularly, though he's training younger volunteers to eventually take his place. He shows them his notebooks, teaches them to recognize the signs of wrong paths, instructs them in the protocols that keep patrol teams safe. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the new volunteers ask him what he really believes about the strange things they encounter, he tells them the truth. That the forest reveals itself differently to those who search for the dead, and that some of what it reveals cannot be explained, only witnessed and remembered, and passed down as warnings to those who will walk these paths after he's gone. The forest holds many secrets, but few are as deeply unsettling as the children who play where no children should be. For decades, visitors to Aokigahara have reported encounters with young ones dressed in clothing that seems out of time, laughing and calling out invitations to join their game. These are not the sounds of nearby campers or day hikers with their families. These are something else entirely, something that appears in the deepest reaches of the forest, where the volcanic rock makes walking treacherous and the twisted trees grow so thick that daylight barely penetrates the canopy. The pattern emerges slowly when you begin to collect the reports, year after year, witness after witness. The encounters share striking similarities that cannot be easily dismissed as coincidence or mass hallucination. The children are always playing, always in groups of 2 or 3, always dressed in styles that seem to belong to different eras of Japanese history. Some witnesses describe seeing children in Meiji period clothing, the distinctive hakama and simple cotton kimonos of the late 1800s. Others report children wearing the more somber dress of the Showa period, the early to mid-20th century, when poverty marked the rural areas surrounding the forest. The clothing is often described as worn but clean, as if lovingly maintained, despite obvious age. What makes these encounters particularly disturbing is not just the anachronistic clothing, but the behavior of the children themselves. They are always engaged in play, seemingly oblivious to the strangeness of their presence in such remote locations. They laugh with a clarity that carries through the dense forest, a sound that should not travel as far as it does through the sound-dampening moss and volcanic stone. And almost invariably, they notice the adults who stumble upon them. They turn, they smile, and they extend an invitation that seems innocent on its surface, but carries with it consequences that witnesses struggle to explain even years later. The Yamamoto family's experience in 2011 represents perhaps the most documented case of this phenomenon, and it is made all the more credible by the physical evidence they brought back from their encounter. Kenji Yamamoto, his wife Yuki, and their 8-year-old daughter Hana had driven from Tokyo for a weekend of exploration around the base of Mount Fuji. They were experienced hikers, well prepared with proper equipment and maps, planning to visit the ice caves that draw tourists to the northern edge of the forest. It was late morning on a Saturday in October, the weather clear and cool, perfect conditions for a family outing. According to their detailed account given to local police and later to researchers, they had parked at the designated area and begun walking the marked trail toward the caves. Hana had run ahead as children do, staying within sight but exploring the interesting formations of root and rock that make the forest floor so distinctive. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard it, the high, clear sound of children's laughter coming from off the trail. Deeper into the forest where the trees grew more densely. Kenji called out, thinking perhaps there was another family nearby that they had not seen in the parking area. There was no response, but the laughter continued, now joined by voices calling out in what sounded like a game. Hana had stopped and was looking in the direction of the sounds, her head tilted in curiosity. Yuki felt uncomfortable immediately. She later told investigators, though she could not articulate why. There was something about the quality of the voices, she said. Something that did not quite match with the sounds of normal children at play. They decided to continue toward the caves, but Hana had already stepped off the marked trail, drawn by the sounds. Kenji followed, keeping his daughter in sight, while Yuki came behind, her phone out and camera ready, the nervous habit of a mother wanting to document every moment of her child's life. They pushed through a particularly dense thicket of trees, the kind of area that tourists typically avoid, and emerged into a small clearing formed by a natural depression in the volcanic rock. Hana stood at the edge of this clearing, perfectly still, looking at something her parents could not initially see. Then they heard her speak, her voice taking on the formal, polite tone that Japanese children use when meeting other children for the first time. She was introducing herself, giving her name and her age, and asking if she could play. Kenji moved forward, reaching his daughter just as she began to move into the clearing, her arms outstretched as if to take someone's hands. This is when Yuki raised her phone and began taking photographs, clicking quickly, trying to capture whatever had captivated her daughter so completely. Kenji saw them then. He insists on this point even now, more than a decade later. 2 children, both appearing to be around Hana's age, both wearing what he described as old-fashioned clothing, simple and rough, like something from a historical drama about rural life. They stood in the clearing, holding out their hands to Hana, their faces smiling but somehow indistinct, as if he could not quite focus on their features despite looking directly at them. The children spoke, their voices overlapping in a strange way that made it difficult to distinguish individual words. But the meaning was clear enough. They wanted Hana to play with them. They wanted to play hide and seek in the forest. They said they knew all the best hiding places, places where no one would ever find her unless she wanted to be found. Kenji's discomfort crystallized into alarm. He reached for Hana, pulling her back. even as she protested that she wanted to play with her new friends. The moment he touched his daughter, the other children seemed to step backward, receding into the shadows at the edge of the clearing, their laughter turning into something that sounded less joyful and more like wind through hollow trees. The Yamamoto family left the clearing quickly, Kenji carrying Hana despite her protests, Yuki following close behind, no longer interested in taking photographs. They made it back to the marked trail and continued to the ice caves, trying to treat the rest of the day as normal as planned, though all three of them remained shaken by the encounter. It was not until they returned home to Tokyo that evening that Yuki reviewed the photographs she had taken, expecting to see the strange children who had so captivated her daughter. The photographs show Hana in the clearing, perfectly clear and in focus. They show the depression in the volcanic rock, the twisted trees at the edges, the dappled sunlight breaking through the canopy above. But they do not show any other children. In every single image, Hana stands alone. Yet her body language tells a different story. Her arms are extended, her hands positioned precisely as if she is holding hands with someone on either side of her. Her face is turned slightly, looking at something outside the frame, her expression delighted and engaged. In one particularly clear image, you can see the fabric of her jacket pulled slightly to one side, as if someone is gently tugging at it, but there is nothing visible in the photograph that could cause this effect. The Yamamoto family shared these photographs with investigators, and copies have been examined by numerous experts in photography and digital imaging. No evidence of tampering or digital manipulation has been found. The images are genuine records of what the camera captured, which makes their content all the more disturbing. Kenji saw the children with his own eyes, standing close enough to touch. The camera, pointed at the same scene at the same moment, recorded only empty space where those children should have been. This pattern of photographic anomaly appears in other cases as well, though the Yamamoto incident is the most thoroughly documented. In 1997, a group of college students reported playing with children they encountered near the Wind Cave area. They described an extended game of hide and seek that seemed to last only a few minutes, but according to their watches and the position of the sun, consumed more than 3 hours. Several members of the group took photographs during this time. The images show the students crouching behind trees, peering around rocks, clearly engaged in a game with others. But no children appear in any of the frames. More disturbingly, several images show vegetation bent or disturbed, as if someone small had recently pushed through it, and in one photograph, a student's hand is extended as if tagged by someone in the game, her expression startled and laughing. But she appears entirely alone in the frame. The missing time element represents another consistent thread in these encounters. Those who agree to play, particularly those who accept the invitation to hide and seek, often find themselves disoriented and displaced when the game ends. They are found miles from where they started, sometimes on the opposite side of the forest, with no memory of walking such distances. Search parties looking for lost hikers have discovered people sitting calmly in areas that should have taken hours of difficult hiking to reach. Yet the missing individuals insist they have only been playing for a short while and cannot explain how they arrived at their current location. In 2008, a man named Takeshi Mori was found by search and rescue teams nearly 8 miles from where he had told his hiking companion he would wait while she returned to their car for a forgotten water bottle. He was sitting on a flat rock, still smiling, still in the mindset of play, and he kept asking the rescuers if they had seen where the children went because he wanted to finish the game. He had been missing for 7 hours, triggering a major search operation, but he insisted he had only been playing for perhaps 20 minutes. His boots showed extensive wear, and his legs bore scratches from pushing through underbrush, evidence of a long trek through difficult terrain. Yet he retained no memory of this journey. The geological survey teams provide perhaps the most unsettling evidence because their testimony removes the element of suggestibility or expectation that might affect casual hikers. These are scientists, trained observers, conducting systematic surveys of the volcanic rock formations that underlie the forest. They work in areas that are genuinely inaccessible to the public, sometimes requiring climbing equipment to reach, always requiring careful navigation through terrain that would be impossible for children to traverse safely. Yet their audio recording equipment, set up to detect geological activity such as settling rock or underground water movement, has captured something else entirely. Multiple teams across multiple years have recorded sounds on their equipment that they describe as childlike laughter and voices calling out in play. The recordings are clear enough to analyze. Audio experts confirm they are indeed children's voices, speaking Japanese, engaged in what sounds like games of tag or hide and seek. But these sounds are recorded in locations where no children could possibly be present. We are talking about areas requiring technical climbing skills to access, areas with no established trails within miles, areas where even experienced adults must proceed with extreme caution. One research team in 2015 placed audio recording equipment in a particularly remote section of the forest, more than 2 miles from the nearest trail, in an area requiring rope work to navigate the volcanic rock formation. The equipment ran continuously for 48 hours. During the playback at various points across both days and nights, children's voices appear on the recording. They are singing playground songs, counting in the traditional way for hide and seek, calling out ready or not, here I come, in voices that sound delighted and innocent. The team returned to collect their equipment and found no evidence of human presence in the area. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest anyone had been there besides themselves. Theories attempting to explain these encounters generally fall into two camps, both equally disturbing in their implications. The first connects these phantom children to historical tragedy, specifically to the periods of famine and hardship that struck rural Japan repeatedly throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The area around Aokigahara was particularly vulnerable to crop failures because of the harsh volcanic soil and short growing season. During the famines of the Tenmai period in the 1780s and the Tempo period in the 1830s, as well as the hardships following World War II, desperate families sometimes made the unbearable choice to abandon children they could not feed, taking them into the forest and leaving them there to die. This practice, known as yubasute, though more commonly associated with abandoning elderly family members, occasionally extended to children during the most desperate times. The theory suggests that the spirits of these abandoned children remain in the forest, endlessly playing the games they can no longer grow too old for, seeking companionship from the living who pass through their eternal playground. Their old-fashioned clothing represents the eras of their deaths. Their invitations to play represent their loneliness and their desire to return to the innocent activities that defined their truncated lives. It is a heartbreaking explanation, one that casts the encounters in the light of tragedy rather than malevolence. But the second theory takes a darker view, one that considers these entities not as genuine child spirits, but as something else that has learned to take the shape of innocence, specifically because innocence lowers our defenses. Children represent no threat in our instinctive calculations of danger. When we encounter children, particularly children at play, our guard drops. We move toward them rather than away. We want to help, to protect, to engage. If something in the forest wanted to lure people deeper into areas where they might become lost, where they might make fatal mistakes in navigation or judgment, what better form could it take than that of children inviting you to play? This theory points to the consistent elements that suggest something more predatory than lonely child spirits. The invitations always involve games that require following, that create confusion about location, that separate individuals from their groups. Hide and seek is the perfect mechanism for this. The game requires you to close your eyes, to count, to deliberately become disoriented about the positions of others. The game involves seeking in ever-widening circles, pushing deeper into terrain you would not normally explore. And when played with these phantom children, the game seems to bend time and distance in ways that leave participants vulnerable and lost. The expressions witnesses describe seeing on the children's faces, when pressed for details, often include a word that sends chills through the interviewer. They describe the children's smiles as hungry, not in a literal sense, but in the way that suggests these beings are sustained by something in the interaction, by something in the act of engaging humans in their games. The laughter, several witnesses note, never quite sounds fully joyful. There is an edge to it, a quality that becomes more apparent in retrospect when the fear has faded enough to allow clear recollection. What cannot be disputed is the consistency of the reports across decades and across different types of witnesses. Families, solo hikers, groups of friends, scientific researchers, all describe essentially the same phenomenon with the same key elements. Children in old clothing, invitations to play hide and seek, missing time. displacement to unexpected locations, and photographic evidence that shows these children are invisible to cameras, even as they appear completely solid and real to human perception. Something in Aokigahara presents itself as children at play, and those who accept its invitation to join the game often find they have wandered much further than they ever intended, both in distance and perhaps in other ways that are harder to measure or define. The Tokyo Research Society expedition into Aokigahara began on the morning of March 14, 2019, with the kind of methodical precision that only career scientists can muster. 7 researchers, representing fields from parapsychology to quantum physics, gathered at the forest's northwestern entrance with equipment that represented over $300,000 in cutting-edge technology. They came armed with electromagnetic field readers, thermal imaging cameras, precision compasses calibrated to detect the slightest magnetic variance, and most critically, a satellite uplink capable of streaming live footage to their laboratory in Tokyo. What they intended as a 6-hour controlled study into reported anomalies would become something else entirely, something that would challenge not just the boundaries of scientific understanding, but the very nature of time and reality itself. The team leader was Dr. Kenji Yamamoto, a physicist who had spent 15 years studying gravitational anomalies in remote locations around the globe. Beside him stood Dr. Hiromi Sato, a psychiatrist specializing in mass hysteria and environmental psychology. The remaining 5 members included 2 electromagnetic specialists, a geologist, a documentary filmmaker, and a field medic. Each had been chosen not just for their expertise, but for their documented skepticism regarding paranormal phenomena. This was meant to be a debunking mission as much as an investigation. They would enter the forest, they would document the prosaic explanations behind the legends, and they would emerge with data that could finally put the supernatural rumors to rest. The live stream began at 9:42 in the morning, Tokyo time. The footage starts unremarkably, almost mundane in its normalcy. Trees, dark soil, the crunch of boots on volcanic rock. Dr. Yamamoto's voice, calm and professorial, narrates their entry into the forest, explaining to the remote viewers how they've divided into pairs, each team carrying redundant equipment to cross-verify any reading. The electromagnetic field meters show baseline readings, the kind you'd expect from any forest with mineral-rich soil. The compasses point steadily north. The thermal cameras reveal nothing but the cool signatures of trees and the warm bodies of the researchers themselves. By the 18-minute mark of the stream, however, the first anomaly appears. Dr. Sato's voice, still controlled but with an edge of genuine curiosity, notes that her compass has begun to drift. Not spinning wildly, not yet, but showing a slow, almost lazy rotation that doesn't correspond with her movement through the forest. She documents this meticulously, noting the exact degree of variance every 30 seconds. Within another 10 minutes, all 7 compasses are showing similar behavior. The team regroups, forming a tight circle in a small clearing, comparing instruments and checking for equipment malfunction. But the compasses continue their inexplicable dance, each one rotating at a different speed, none of them agreeing on magnetic north anymore. At the 40-minute mark, the electromagnetic field readers begin their symphony of the impossible. The devices, designed to detect fields measured in milligauss, start registering spikes that climb into ranges that should only exist near high-voltage power lines or powerful electromagnets. But there are no such sources in Aokigahara. More disturbing than the magnitude of the readings is their pattern. The spikes come in waves, in rhythms that one of the electromagnetic specialists, Dr. Tanaka, notes with audible unease, sound almost like a heartbeat. Slow, steady pulses of electromagnetic energy emanating from no identifiable source, washing over the team in intervals of exactly 11 seconds. 11 seconds of baseline readings, then a spike that drives the meters into the red, then 11 seconds of silence again. The team's excitement is palpable in the footage. This is what they came for. Unexplainable data that could represent a genuine scientific discovery. They fan out again, trying to triangulate the source of the electromagnetic pulses. The thermal cameras are deployed more actively now, scanning the forest in sweeping arcs. And that's when they capture the first figure. At 1 hour and 7 minutes into the stream, Dr. Ishida's thermal camera picks up a humanoid heat signature approximately 60 meters to the northeast. The temperature differential suggests a living being, human-sized, radiating warmth. She calls out, announcing herself, assuming they've encountered another hiker, but the figure moves in a way that immediately registers as wrong. It crosses the distance between two trees, a span of at least 4 meters, in what the timestamp reveals is less than a third of a second. Not running, not jumping, simply existing in one location and then existing in another, with no visible transition between the two states. The mood in the livestream shifts. The excited chatter of scientific discovery gives way to something more primal. Dr. Yamamoto's voice, still attempting authority, suggests they may be seeing equipment glitches, artifacts of electromagnetic interference affecting the thermal cameras. But then all 3 thermal units pick up the figures. Not one, but dozens of them, surrounding the team in a loose circle that slowly, impossibly quickly, begins to contract. Heat signatures moving through the trees at speeds that violate basic physics, appearing and disappearing, their movements jerky and wrong when viewed frame by frame. At 1 hour and 33 minutes, Dr. Sato makes her first clinical observation about the forest itself. Her training as a psychiatrist has taught her to observe her own mental state with the same rigor she applies to patients, and she begins to narrate, with the careful diction of someone fighting to maintain objectivity, that something feels fundamentally wrong about their location. Not frightening, she clarifies, not yet, but wrong in a way she struggles to articulate. She describes a sensation of being watched not by eyes, but by something more fundamental, as though the attention of some vast intelligence has turned toward them like a spotlight swinging across a stage. The other team members, emboldened perhaps by her willingness to vocalize what they've been feeling, begin to add their own observations. The air feels thick, heavier than it should. Sounds seem muted, as though they're speaking through layers of cloth. The trees, which should be swaying in the documented wind, stand unnaturally still. And beneath it all, a sensation that Dr. Tanaka describes as hunger, though he immediately acknowledges he has no rational basis for the description. At 2 hours and 14 minutes, the compasses begin to spin violently. Not drift, not wander, but whirl like compass needles caught in the field of a massive magnet being rotated at high speed. The electromagnetic readings spike beyond the capacity of the meters to measure, the digital displays simply showing error messages. And the thermal cameras now reveal the humanoid figures have stopped moving entirely. They stand motionless among the trees, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, forming concentric circles around the research team at varying distances. Dr. Yamamoto makes the decision to abort the expedition. His voice on the live stream is professionally calm, but the speed with which he issues the command betrays his fear. They will maintain their instruments in recording mode. They will walk in formation back toward their entry point, and they will document everything. A controlled withdrawal, a tactical retreat dressed in the language of scientific procedure. But when they begin to walk, the forest itself seems to resist. Not physically, there are no grasping branches or rising roots, but spatially. The team walks, for what the livestream timestamp shows is 17 minutes, moving at a brisk pace that should cover at least 1.5 kilometers. Yet when they pause to check their GPS units, they discover they've traveled less than 50 meters. Dr. Ishida, the geologist, recognizes a distinctive rock formation they passed shortly after the initial compass anomalies. Somehow, despite walking in a straight line away from it, they've returned to the same location. The final 18 minutes of coherent footage begins at the 2 hour and 41 minute mark of the stream. This is when Dr. Sato's clinical detachment finally shatters. She stops walking, and her voice, when she speaks, carries the hollow quality of someone receiving a transmission from a source beyond themselves. She describes the forest as hungry, but elaborates in a way that none of the team will remember authorizing. She speaks of a presence that has existed in this location for longer than human civilization, something that predates the volcanic formation of the land itself. It does not live in the forest, she explains with the careful precision of a diagnosis. It wears the forest like humans wear clothing, a covering that allows it to interface with a world it does not naturally inhabit. And it feeds, not on flesh, not on blood, but on the specific frequency of despair that human consciousness produces. It has cultivated this place, shaped it over centuries into a beacon that draws the suffering and the hopeless, and when they arrive, it consumes the exquisite darkness of their final moments. The suicides are not tragic coincidences, Dr. Sato intones, they are a harvest. And now, having drawn the attention of the researchers, having tasted their initial fear and growing terror, the entity wants more. The live stream descends into chaos in stages. First, Dr. Tanaka begins to scream, a sound of pure animal panic that no human throat should be capable of sustaining. He points at something beyond the camera's view and simply runs, crashing through the undergrowth with no regard for direction or safety. His thermal signature appears on another team member's camera for perhaps 3 seconds before it winks out entirely, not fading into the distance but simply ceasing to exist. Then, the others begin to run. Not together, not in any coordinated evacuation, but in 7 different directions simultaneously, as though each researcher has suddenly perceived a unique and immediate threat, visible only to themselves. The live stream fragments, the satellite uplink struggling to maintain connection with cameras now scattered across the forest. Brief flashes of footage show trees rushing past, the nauseating bounce of handheld cameras in full sprint, and always, at the edge of thermal vision, those humanoid figures keeping pace with impossible ease. Dr. Yamamoto's camera captures the last coherent audio. He's no longer running, he's collapsed against a tree, and his breathing comes in ragged gasps punctuated by laughter. Not the laughter of humor, but of a mind encountering something so far beyond its capacity to process that sanity itself begins to fragment. He looks directly into the camera and whispers that it's beautiful, that the entity is showing him what it truly is, and that human language has no framework to contain such revelation. Then his camera feed corrupts into static. The live stream continues for another 9 minutes, but the footage is largely unusable. Fragments of corrupted video, audio that sounds like human voices played backward and at varying speeds, and thermal imagery that suggests impossible geometries, heat sources that form patterns no natural phenomenon could create. The stream ends abruptly at 3 hours and 22 minutes. Not a gradual loss of signal, but an instantaneous cessation, as though someone had simply switched off the transmission. The rescue operation began 4 hours later, when the Tokyo laboratory realized the team had not emerged from the forest at their scheduled extraction time. 40 volunteers, including professional search and rescue personnel and local guides, entered Aokigahara from multiple access points. They found the first researcher, Dr. Ishida, at 11:47 that night, nearly 8 kilometers from the expedition's last known location. She was sitting upright against a tree, eyes open, completely unresponsive to stimuli. Her equipment was missing. Her clothing was torn, though she bore no physical injuries. The second researcher, Dr. Tanaka, was discovered the following morning, 6 kilometers in the opposite direction. He was curled in a fetal position in a shallow depression, also catatonic, also physically unharmed but mentally unreachable. The third, an electromagnetic specialist named Dr. Fujimoto, was found that afternoon, and her condition matched the others precisely. Eyes open, breathing steady, but utterly absent behind those staring eyes. The remaining 4 researchers were never found. Extensive searches covering over 100 square kilometers of the forest revealed no trace of them. No equipment, no clothing, no remain. They had simply vanished into Aokigahara, as completely as the hundreds of suicide victims whose bodies are discovered there each year. The 3 survivors remained catatonic for weeks. They were hospitalized, subjected to every neurological test available, and found to be physically healthy. Their brains showed normal activity, their bodies functioned properly, but something essential had withdrawn so deeply that no medical intervention could reach it. Then, on the same day, 42 days after their rescue, all 3 emerged from their catatonia simultaneously. Nurses reported that at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, each survivor, in their separate hospital rooms, simply blinked and returned. Their testimonies, given independently with no opportunity for collaboration, matched with a precision that disturbed the investigating authorities. Each described an entity that existed in a state adjacent to normal reality, something ancient beyond human comprehension that had learned to manifest in locations saturated with human suffering. It did not create the suffering, they explained. but it had learned to recognize the places where the barriers between its realm and ours grew thin with accumulated despair. Aokigahara was not the only such place, but it was one of the most potent, generations of death having soaked the ground with the exact emotional frequency the entity required for sustenance. They described being hunted through the forest by something that experienced time differently than humans, something that could exist in multiple locations simultaneously, that could stretch 6 hours into subjective eternities. And they spoke of a terrible offer, extended to each of them in their moment of greatest terror. The entity would release them, allow them to return, but they would carry a fragment of it with them always, a seed of its presence that would color every moment of their remaining lives with the memory of its hunger. The hard drives recovered from the expedition site contained the final, most disturbing evidence. 83 hours of footage from multiple cameras, all time-stamped, all sequential, documenting an expedition that external records proved lasted only 6 hours from entry to the cessation of the livestream. 83 hours of the researchers wandering through Aokigahara, their degradation documented in excruciating detail. Footage showing them walking in circles, encountering themselves from hours earlier, the landscape subtly changing around them while remaining fundamentally the same. And always in the background of every frame, those thermal signatures watching, waiting, feeding on the slowly building terror of 7 people who came seeking scientific truth and found something far older and hungrier instead. After everything we've explored, after examining the history, the deaths, the testimonies, and the scientific anomalies, we arrive at the most unsettling truth of all. We still don't understand Aokigahara. Every investigation, every research team, every technological advancement we've brought to bear on this forest has only succeeded in deepening the mystery. The more we learn, the less sense it makes. The more we document, the stranger it becomes. Scientists have measured the magnetic fields. They've analyzed the soil composition. They've studied the tree growth patterns and the geological formations beneath the forest floor. And yet, none of their findings can adequately explain what happens there. The magnetic anomalies are real, but they shouldn't be strong enough to cause the disorientation that people report. The density of the trees is significant, but other forests are equally dense without inspiring the same dread. The volcanic rock beneath is unusual, but similar formations exist elsewhere without the same effects. So we're left with theories, competing explanations that range from the scientific to the supernatural, none of them complete, all of them troubling in their own way. Some researchers have proposed that Aokigahara is an entity unto itself, not simply a location, but a conscious presence that feeds on human suffering. This theory suggests that centuries of death have created something, a psychic accumulation of despair and anguish that has taken on a life of its own. According to this perspective, the forest doesn't simply attract the suicidal. It calls to them. It draws them in, feeding on their final moments of terror and hopelessness. Each death strengthens it, adds to its power, increases its reach. The Japanese folklore about yurei, the vengeful spirits trapped in places of trauma, might not be metaphorical at all. Perhaps what we're dealing with is a collective haunting on a scale never before documented. Thousands of lost souls merged into a single, hungry darkness. Others believe Aokigahara represents a dimensional thin point, a place where the barrier between realities has worn dangerously weak. This would explain the reports of people seeing things that shouldn't exist, hearing voices from nowhere, experiencing time distortions and spatial anomalies. If multiple dimensions bleed together in this location, then the forest becomes a kind of crossroads between worlds. Those who enter might not simply be lost in our reality. They might slip through into somewhere else entirely. This theory has gained traction among certain researchers because it accounts for the vanishings, the ones where no body is ever found despite exhaustive searches. Where do those people go? Perhaps they don't die in any conventional sense. Perhaps they simply step through into another layer of existence and can never find their way back. Then there's the most disturbing theory of all, that Aokigahara has achieved a form of consciousness through centuries of absorbing death, that the forest itself has awakened, transformed by the constant flow of human endings into something aware, something purposeful. The trees would be its neurons, The roots its neural network, the soil its memory banks storing every suicide, every moment of final despair. This living forest wouldn't be benevolent or malevolent in any human sense. It would simply be hungry, driven by needs we can't comprehend, operating according to logic that has nothing to do with our understanding of life and death. Modern research has only made these theories more plausible, not less. Every new investigation brings back data that shouldn't exist. Recording equipment captures sounds at frequencies that don't match any known natural source. Cameras malfunction in ways that technicians can't explain, producing images that show things not visible to the naked eye. Infrared scans reveal heat signatures that appear and disappear without corresponding to any physical presence. In 2009, a university research team spent 3 weeks conducting the most comprehensive study of the forest ever attempted. They used ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic field detectors, motion-sensing cameras, and audio recording equipment distributed throughout the forest. What they found has never been fully disclosed to the public, but according to leaked reports, their equipment recorded what appeared to be coordinated movement patterns throughout the forest at night. Not animals. Something else. Something that moved through the trees in organized formations, responding to the presence of researchers as if aware of being observed. The Japanese government's response to ongoing research has been increasingly restrictive. Certain areas of the forest are now completely off-limits, not just to tourists but to researchers as well. Official explanations cite conservation efforts and respect for the deceased, but those who have worked with government agencies tell a different story. They speak of collected evidence that has been classified, of footage that has been quietly seized, of research findings that were never allowed to be published. Multiple sources confirm that government agencies have been systematically collecting footage from the forest for years. Video recordings from tourists, surveillance camera data, even satellite imagery. This material is not made available to researchers. It's not archived in any public database. It simply disappears into government facilities, analyzed by teams whose findings are never shared. Why? What have they found that requires this level of secrecy? Some who have seen portions of this classified material describe aerial footage showing movement patterns in the forest canopy that suggest intelligence. Trees that seem to respond to human presence from hundreds of meters away. Sections of the forest where the vegetation appears to deliberately create mazes, pathways that lead inward but never out. One former government consultant spoke of time-lapse photography showing the forest physically changing its layout. Trees shifting position over periods of months in ways that shouldn't be botanically possible. And still, they come. Despite everything we know, despite the warnings and the barriers and the signs, dozens of people enter Aokigahara each year and vanish completely. Not suicides where bodies are later found. True disappearances. Search parties find nothing. Not clothing, not personal effects, not remains. Just absence. As if these people were erased from existence. The statistics are kept deliberately vague by authorities, but researchers estimate at least 20 to 30 complete vanishings per year. People who entered the forest and were simply removed from reality. Their families wait for news that never comes. Their cases remain open, unsolved, impossible. What happens to them? Did they lose themselves in the maze of trees and die in locations too remote to be found? Or did something else occur? Something that our current understanding of reality can't accommodate? The forest keeps its secrets, and whatever darkness dwells within grows stronger with each passing year, fed by centuries of death and an endless supply of human despair. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from above. Aerial photography of Aokigahara, when examined closely, reveals something that shouldn't be possible. The patterns formed by the trees, the spacing and arrangement of vegetation, create symbols when viewed from sufficient altitude. Not random formations that coincidentally resemble shapes. Deliberate symbols. Complex geometric patterns and configurations that match no known language, no identified culture, no documented system of communication. Multiple photographs taken from aircraft and satellites over the years show these patterns clearly. What makes them truly disturbing is that they change. Images taken in 2003 show one configuration. Photos from 2010 show the same areas with different patterns. The forest, somehow, is rearranging itself to create new symbols, new messages written in a language we don't understand. Is it trying to communicate? Or is it calling to something? Drawing something closer? The symbols appear most clearly in the densest sections of the forest, the areas where the disappearances are most frequent, where even experienced guides refuse to enter. Whatever Aokigahara is trying to say, whatever it's attempting to summon or signal, remains beyond our comprehension. The mystery endures. The darkness waits. And somewhere in those endless trees, under that canopy of shadows, something continues to hunger. Something continues to grow. Something continues to call. And people, drawn by forces they don't understand, continue to answer that call, walking into the green darkness and leaving behind nothing but questions that may never be answered. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.